Now, the other day I covered an interview that Rian Johnson did with Rolling Stone, one that talked about some of the decisions he made with The Last Jedi and how he won't be doing that trilogy he was announced to be doing years ago. But one part that I didn't talk about in that video was the fact that Rian Johnson admitted to being a prequel hater, saying in response to a question asking him about the response to his movie, To The Last Jedi, about how some people really didn't like it. Well, he said that I was in college when the prequels came out. My friends and I were prequel hate central. Everyone was ruthless at that time. And of course, now the prequels are embraced. I'm not saying that as a facile, oh, things will flip around in 20 years, you'll see. It's more that this push and pull and this hatred to stuff that seems new, this is all part of being a Star Wars fan. Culture war garbage aside, I think that essential part of it is a healthy part. And first of all here, in one sense, I do sort of appreciate what he said there, that yes, even the hatred of some things or being very critical is part of being a Star Wars fan. You are allowed to not like it or to be disappointed with part of it and to say as much. And in all reality, I have zero problem with him being a prequel hater. That is completely fine by me. There are plenty of people, plenty of fans who don't like those movies, and that is just fine. I personally love the films, but if you don't, I don't see that as a reason why we have to be enemies or something. However, if you are someone who hated the prequels, I'm not so sure I would have hired you to then work on the sequel trilogy to write one of the films in it. I mean, like them or not, for better or worse, they are Star Wars. They are a part of the first 6 Star Wars or Skywalker movies created by George Lucas, and they make one cohesive story. So if you want to carry on that story, you can't ignore half of it because you didn't like it. Same then goes for JJ Abrams, who has also said some less than kind things about the prequels, though he has never admitted to being a prequel hater as far as I know. But he has said some less than flattering things about it over the years, though he did seem to soften when he got the job to write the sequels or to write The Force Awakens. But either way, he especially didn't seem to be a fan of things like the midichlorians, which, again, he's free to not like. I have no ill will towards him, or, again, Rian Johnson because of him not liking the prequels. That's fine, even with Abrams all but saying when he started to film The Force Awakens that they were going back to doing things the old-fashioned way and going back to practical effects, as if the prequels were some sort of mistake for embracing more CGI, or had done things wrong because of that. And so, with an attitude like that, with the attitude of seemingly not being a fan of half of Star Wars, like with Rian Johnson, I don't know that JJ Abrams should have been making a movie in the Skywalker saga if, again, he didn't like half of it. I mean, many of us fans expected the sequels to, yes, to be their own thing in many respects, to tell their own story, but to also be a completion of the whole story, the whole Skywalker saga. Because, like it or not, the first 6 movies are really the story of Anakin Skywalker, his fall, his reign as Darth Vader, his redemption, and how he is saved by his son. That is the story of Star Wars. And then, in the sequels, it should have been, I think anyway, but I think it should have been about his legacy, or which legacy wins out in the end. The legacy of Darth Vader, or the legacy of Anakin Skywalker, which is why, as I have talked about before in videos, I really wanted to see Rey be a sort of proxy for the legacy of Anakin, that Anakin's old lightsaber was leading her to Luke to be trained so that she could again be this sort of light side proxy of Anakin, all the while Kylo Ren or Ben Solo would be this dark side proxy of Darth Vader, or at least that's what I would have done given the characters and settings or situations we got in the sequels. I certainly don't think the two should have been a dyad and all of that. But either way, it is crazy to think that the name Anakin is never uttered in the sequels, and that his only appearance, if it can be called that, is his voice heard briefly among all the other Jedi that we hear at the end of The Rise of Skywalker. Somehow we don't get an appearance of the actual Force ghost of Anakin, something that I would have argued going into the trilogy was a foregone conclusion, that of course at some point we see Luke and Anakin talking. And maybe even talking to the next generation of Skywalkers, or talking to Rey and telling her that there is some sort of remnant of Darth Vader corrupting him, corrupting Ben Solo. I don't know, there's so much that could have been done with that idea that it makes me sad to think about. It just baffles me that at no point seemingly did anyone at Lucasfilm, or anyone with the power to do something about it, did any of them say, maybe Anakin Skywalker should in some respect be a part of this story, and a pretty big part of it, considering the first 6 movies are really his story as well. And over the years, I have talked a lot about what went wrong with the sequels, what were the biggest mistakes made, and all of that. But I haven't talked too much about what may have been the biggest miscalculation on the part of Disney and Lucasfilm. That being, they really thought everybody hated the prequels. And no, I don't mean literally, but they thought the general consensus on those films were that they were not good and they were not enjoyed by all that many, and certainly not enough to really embrace them and risk alienating all the people who didn't like them with the sequel trilogy. When in reality, there is an entire generation that grew up with those films, and there are plenty from the OT generation who also enjoyed those movies and didn't want to see them all but ignored in the sequels. And I dare say, and I could be wrong here, but I dare say a good deal of the people who didn't like the prequels simply did not like the movies themselves. They thought the story was solid enough, but that the execution of that story was lacking. In other words, if you take virtually the same story and let someone else write it, perhaps, instead of George Lucas writing the whole thing, and then you maybe let some others direct the films, maybe the prequels may have actually been excellent in their eyes because, again, the story was fine, it was just the making of the movies that went wrong. And that is a lot different than the reason why people seem to not like the sequels, where from what I have seen, and I have seen a lot of people speak their piece about those movies, but the story or what was done with the characters seems to be the main problem with the sequels. It's not people saying, well, there's a great story there, it's just poor execution. No, it's the decisions made with the story that seem to bother people the most. Though, no, the movies weren't great either. Anyway, to be clear, I'm not saying ignoring the prequels is the only thing wrong with the sequel trilogy. There are a lot of things wrong with the sequel trilogy, in my opinion. I'm simply saying the apparent mindset going into them by the 2 primary writers of the trilogy, by Abrams and Johnson, that the prequels weren't liked and should be all but ignored, outside of a throwaway line about a clone army in The Force Awakens and then mentioning Darth Sidious in The Last Jedi, and then finally, kinda, I guess, embracing them a bit more in The Rise of Skywalker when it was much, much too late, and after they had realized, oh, maybe people actually liked the prequels. But I think a strong case could be made that the mindset of the primary writers, not to mention those in charge at Lucasfilm and Disney, is what doomed the sequel trilogy from the very start, before pen ever met paper and before they ever started to write it or even not plan it out. That instead of trying to do something new and different, which was Lucas's biggest complaint about The Force Awakens, that it didn't try or didn't want to be anything new and different, but instead of being new as well as a continuation of the story Lucas had created, the story of Anakin, as well as others, yes, it's not just Anakin's story, the sequels instead tried to almost be a soft reboot of the original trilogy, or at least The Force Awakens tried to be a remake of A New Hope, rather than again simply being the next part of the story. We didn't need to do it all over again. We had 6 amazing episodes, and episode 7 should have been a continuation of that. And it doesn't seem like it was, in large part because, again, the guys writing it didn't like the prequels. Alright, well I think that is going to be all I got for you this time. Now it is your turn to take to the comments below and tell me what you think about this one. Do you think not embracing the prequels, not trying to incorporate Anakin into the story more, or at all, was one of the biggest mistakes of the sequels? Did the hate for them cloud the judgment of Abrams and Johnson, as well as others at Disney and Lucasfilm who did nothing about it? Whatever you think though, leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.